So in this video, we're going to talk about the term structure of interest rates. That is, how are interest rates created? In this respect, we're going to look at a table or a graph, if you will, of what interest rates look like over the near term. So we're going to talk about something called the yield curve. We're going to talk about interest rates under certainty and uncertainty, some theories about how the curves and how interest rates are created, and then in the end, we'll talk about how to interpret this information or what to do with this information. So yield curves display the relationship between time and yield to maturity. As you can see here, in January 2006, it was a relatively flat curve. Here's short-term interest rates for 1 month, and here's the rate. And then for a 30-year T-bond, this is the rate then. So you can see they're fairly close together. Then we had a rising yield curve, a declining yield curve, and then we had this hump-shaped yield curve. So we want to talk about how this curve is created, right? How does that ultimately work for us? So if we want to kind of look at what yield curves look like, there is a website, gives us kind of an interesting relationship, shows us how the yield curve changes and then also how the S&P 500 changes right along with that. So if we go to, I'll open this up real quick. Here's this website, and this side is the yield curve, and you can see that right now this is a very kind of a flat yield curve that we have 2.32% on the bottom, and I think we click up here, it's obviously it's not 4.65, so it must be like around 3. So it's a pretty flat yield curve. And of course, here's the S&P 500 over the last bunch of years. So what we can do is we can look at it, and they animate this, and we will go back in time to where we look at the yield curve on this date, and we'll see how the yield curve changes with the S&P 500. Now remember that the yield curve are returns, and the yield curve, or the S&P 500, these are prices. So when the yield curve is going up, that means prices in bonds are falling, and when the prices are going up, that means the yield on the S&P 500, they're also falling. So let's kind of look, and we'll just look at this quickly, see what happens. And you can follow this red line across, and of course you can see that we're showing some increasing bond prices, and we saw some increasing yield curves. So what do you think will happen once we start to get this decline? Stock prices will be falling. What should be happening to bond prices? We see as the yield curve is falling, what that means is that the yield curve, yield or bond prices themselves are also falling. So we have in general here the relationship that stocks and bonds work conversely with each other. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on in some other courses, and certainly maybe in some other chapters. So again, that website helps us get a picture, if you will, of what's going on. So again, yields on different types of maturities aren't all equal, of course, right? And one of the ways to kind of think our way through this pricing mechanism and how things all work together is to consider zero coupon bonds. So the value of a bond is really a series of zero coupon bonds. If you consider a 10% coupon bond, in a year, that bond could pay you $100. So that is, for this year, that is a zero coupon bond of $100 for 1 year, etc., etc. So the value of the bond is essentially just a sum of the present value of its parts. So here, if we look at, we have 4 maturity years here, the yield to maturities for some bonds, and here we have the prices of bonds. So what we can notice here, what we find is that the value of a 3-year bond, a bond for 3 years, a 10% coupon. If you're using this discount rate, the price of this bond should roughly be $1,082 is the value over 3-year window. The yield to maturity then of the bond is about 6.88%. Since 6.88% is less than this 3-year rate of 7, the question might come to us as, is this a potential arbitrage moment, right? The challenge that we have with this direct relationship is there is a difference between what's referred to as a pure yield curve and an on-the-run yield curve. A pure yield curve uses stripped or zero coupon treasury, and an on-the-run yield curve uses recent real prices. So typically, they're not going to be exactly equal. So that concept of the idea of not being equal and arbitrage being potentially there really probably isn't true, just because of the inaccuracies between the two kinds of curves. But let's think about a yield curve under certainty. We know exactly what's going to happen in the future, right? So if you wanted to invest for 2 years, you could either buy and hold a 2-year zero coupon bond, or you could roll over a series of 1-year bonds. In equilibrium, those two investments, since they're in the same type of investment, the same investment exactly, except one's a 2-year and one's 2 1-years, they have to have the same return under the law of one price. So here's our strategy. Here is our bond. This is a 2-year investment, right, of a bond. Of course, 6% is our interest rate over these 2 years. Now that return, this 1.06 squared, has to be equal to the product of these 2 1-years. And the first year is 1.05. We need to solve for this second piece here. But these two investments have to have the exact same returns. So how we would solve for this, right? 1 plus the 2-year yield, since it's 2 years, it's squared, equals the other 2. And of course, if we just took the square root of both, we would be fine. But if we wanted to solve for R2, right, it's 1 plus y2 squared divided by 1 plus r1. And if you do that math, right, 1.06 squared divided by 1.05, we end up with R2 being equal to roughly 7%. So what we're looking at is what's referred to as the difference between something called the spot rate, that's the given price today, and the short rate. That's the rate of a given maturity at different points in time. Now the spot rate is just the geometric average of its component short rates. Now this supposes certainty, right? Do we know things for certain? If next year's short rate is greater than this year's yield, that means that the yield curve will slope upward, and we may indicate that interest rates are expected to rise. On the other hand, if, again, those future 1-year rates are less than today's, we would expect interest rates to fall. So this is one of our first indicators, if you will, of how we can use this information. Do we think interest rates in the near term are going to increase or decrease? Now, going to a much longer time frame, going out 5, 6, 7, 8 years, again, now we're going to start to add some uncertainty to the issue. So again, we'll talk about this in the next video.